The knock came just as I was pouring my morning coffee, sharp, insistent. It was the kind of knock that demanded attention, not patience. I hadn't been expecting anyone, not today, not after the week I'd just had. I set my mug down, wiped my hands on my robe, and walked toward the door, letting out a slow breath. I wasn't ready for what I saw when I opened it. There she was, Megan Stevens, my husband's new girlfriend, the one he had left me for, the one he had proudly flaunted in public while I was left to pick up the pieces of my broken life. She was grinning. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before she spoke, her voice oozing with smug satisfaction. "You need to start packing, Lila Hartman. We're moving in." She tilted her head, eyes sparkling with triumph as she held up a folded piece of paper. Some kind of deed, or a contract, I couldn't tell. "Ethan didn't tell you," she sneered. "This house is his now, so I'd start boxing up your things if I were you. We're taking over." A cold, creeping chill spread through my chest, but instead of feeling angry or panicked, I felt something else. Something colder. Something calmer. I let my lips curl into a smile, because I wasn't alone. Behind her, just out of her line of sight, was my lawyer, and I knew something she didn't. This had all started months ago, or maybe, if I was being honest, years. Ethan and I had been married for 12 years, and for most of that time, I'd been the one holding everything together. I organized the finances. I made sure the mortgage was paid. I was the one putting in the effort. But when Ethan started pulling away, I ignored the signs at first. The late nights at work, how his phone never seemed to leave his hand, the whispered conversations in another room. But then I saw them together. It was supposed to be a girls' night out, a break from the stresses of a marriage I was desperately trying to hold on to. But fate had other plans. There they were, sitting in the corner of the restaurant, his hand resting on hers, laughing in a way I hadn't seen in years. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I didn't confront him. Not then. Instead, I went home and started planning. Because if Ethan thought he could humiliate me, if he thought he could just take what was mine and walk away unscathed, he was wrong. Megan Stevens' smile widened, thinking my silence meant I was in shock. "I know this is hard for you, Lila Hartman," she said, feigning sympathy as she tucked the papers under her arm. "But Ethan and I are in love. It's time for you to move on." She placed a manicured hand on the doorframe as though she already owned it, as if she had already won. I almost laughed. Instead, I stepped back slowly and gestured for her to come inside. Her eyebrows shot up in surprise. She hadn't been expecting that. She stepped inside cautiously, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. The house I had chosen, the one I had built, with walls that held years of memories, stood behind her. My lawyer followed, silent and composed. I shut the door, then turned to face her. "Megan Stevens," I said smoothly, taking my time. "There's something you should know." Her smirk faltered. My lawyer stepped forward, making his presence known. And then the real game began. Megan Stevens' smirk faded entirely as my lawyer advanced, his presence finally starting to sink in. The confidence with which she had waltzed in, thinking she had already won, began to crack. What is this?" she asked, her voice less steady now. I took a slow, measured breath before responding. "You seem so sure of yourself, Megan Stevens," I said, tilting my head and watching her. "Like you already own this house. Like you think you and Ethan have outsmarted me." Her fingers tightened around the papers she was holding, and her posture shifted slightly. She was beginning to realize that something was wrong, but she wasn't quite ready to let go of her smug confidence. "Ethan transferred ownership to himself," she snapped, holding up the document. "He said you didn't have a choice. This house is his now." I smiled again. "Did he?" I glanced at my lawyer, who had remained quiet this entire time, calmly flipping through his folder. He adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Harrison," he said formally, addressing me and ignoring Megan Stevens completely. "Would you like to explain, or shall I?" I turned back to Megan Stevens, taking in the way her confidence was now beginning to falter. "Go ahead," I said. "I think she should hear it from a professional." My lawyer cleared his throat, then turned to Megan Stevens, who was clutching the papers like they were a lifeline. "You see, Miss Megan Stevens, is it?" He didn't wait for her to answer. The house wasn't Ethan's to give away. Megan Stevens blinked, the silence stretching on. "What?" she asked, her voice cracking. My lawyer's tone remained calm, almost amused. "This house," he gestured around us, "was never in Ethan's name, not before, not now, and certainly not in the divorce proceedings." Megan Stevens's face drained of color, but she recovered quickly, shaking her head. "That's not true," she scoffed. "Ethan told me." "Ethan lied," I cut in. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I turned and walked to the side table near the entrance, picking up a different set of papers. Real documents this time. I held them up between my fingers. "This house," I said, "was mine." Before I ever met Ethan, I had said it, my voice calm and steady. It was left to me in my grandmother's will. I never put Ethan on the deed, no matter how many times he begged. He never had any legal right to this house during our marriage, and he sure as hell doesn't have any now. Megan Stevens's mouth hung open, but no words came out. I stepped forward, letting the space between us shrink. "Whatever papers he handed you, whatever promises he made, it's all worthless." The silence stretched for what felt like forever, and then it clicked. I saw it in her expression, the smug confidence melting away, replaced by confusion, doubt, and eventually, panic. Ethan had always underestimated me. I couldn't help but remember how he'd laugh when I insisted on keeping things separate. "Why does it matter?" he'd say. "We're married, so what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine." Except, in reality, he didn't believe that. What was mine became his, and what was his stayed his. I had noticed it early on, the way he'd casually take money from our joint account, but would hesitate if I ever asked for anything of his. I'd ignored it then, telling myself that marriage was about trust, about compromise. I trusted him, but he thought he could count on me being too naive, too emotionally shattered by his betrayal, to fight back. What he didn't realize, and what neither he nor Megan Stevens knew, was that I had been fighting back the moment I saw him with her. Megan Stevens took a shaky breath and squared her shoulders. "Ethan said the house was his," she repeated, but now it almost sounded like she was trying to convince herself. "He said he worked it all out with the lawyers." My lawyer sighed, snapping his folder shut. "He didn't work anything out," he said bluntly. "What he did was attempt to file fraudulent paperwork, which I'm assuming is what you're holding right now." Megan Stevens's grip on the papers loosened. I folded my arms across my chest, letting the silence weigh on her. Then, she muttered under her breath, "That bastard." Her voice trembled with anger. I raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, Megan Stevens?" She spun around to face me so fast I almost found it amusing. "Ethan told me this was his house. He said he was kicking you out. He said we were moving in, starting fresh." I tilted my head, eyeing her with feigned curiosity. "And you believed him?" Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. I could practically see the gears turning in her head. She was starting to realize something. If Ethan had lied about this, then what else had he lied about? She turned back to my lawyer. "So, are you saying that legally he has nothing?" My lawyer adjusted his tie and looked at her, the calmness of his voice almost cutting through the tension. "Exactly what I'm saying." Megan Stevens inhaled sharply, her hand gripping her phone tightly. I could see her mind working, calculating her next move. I already knew what she was going to do. She was about to call Ethan. She was going to demand answers, and soon she'd realize far too late that she had attached herself to a sinking ship. I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of my mouth. She had walked in here thinking she was the one claiming victory. Instead, she was in for a rude awakening, one that Ethan had already learned the hard way. Megan Stevens's hands shook as she clutched her phone, her nails tapping impatiently against the screen. I watched with mild amusement as she frantically scrolled through her contacts, her breath coming in sharp, angry bursts. She was losing it. The shift in her behavior was almost comical. Just minutes ago, she had been standing in my doorway, full of smug certainty that she was about to take over my home. Now, she was scrambling, desperately trying to figure out just how badly she'd been played. I leaned casually against the kitchen counter, content to watch the inevitable unfold. She finally pressed dial. The phone rang once, twice, and then Ethan answered. "Hey, babe!" Ethan's voice came through loud and confident, cocky as ever, completely unaware of the storm raging on the other end. Megan Stevens didn't hesitate. "You lying piece of garbage!" she screamed, her voice rising with every word. "You told me the house was yours, that we were moving in, that you were throwing Lila Hartman out." There was a long pause on the other end. I could practically hear Ethan trying to process what was happening. What?" he finally said, confusion creeping into his voice. Megan Stevens whipped around to face me, her eyes blazing. "Tell him," she demanded. I smirked, taking a slow sip of my coffee before setting the mug down. "Hey, Ethan," I said smoothly. "Quite the day we're having, huh?" Another pause, this one longer. Then, Ethan's voice returned, but it wasn't as confident as before. "What's going on?" Megan Stevens gritted her teeth. "What's going on? I'll tell you what's going on," she shot back. "I showed up at Lila Hartman's house, ready to move in like you told me, and guess what?" She turned to me, eyes burning with fury. "Lila Hartman still owns the house." I could almost hear Ethan's stomach drop through the phone. That's not possible," he stammered. I filed the paperwork." Megan Stevens cut him off. "You filed nothing. You lied to me. You said we'd be starting fresh. You said you'd taken care of everything." Ethan's breathing grew more labored. He was finally coming to terms with the fact that his brilliant little plan had come crashing down, and I was enjoying every second of it. "You don't get it, Ethan," he said quickly, his voice defensive. "I was going to fix it." Megan Stevens scoffed. "Fix it? You told me everything was fine. You told me we had nothing to worry about, that you got everything in the divorce." I raised an eyebrow. "Everything? Oh, Ethan, you poor delusional man." I crossed my arms and decided to throw him a bone. "Ethan, you didn't get the house. You didn't get the business. You didn't even get the joint account you tried to drain. The only thing you got was your car." Megan Stevens turned back to the phone. "And that car is what? A 10-year-old sedan?" Ethan was silent. Megan Stevens let out a bitter laugh. "Oh my God, you really have nothing." I watched her expression shift as something dangerous flickered in her eyes. She was starting to realize that Ethan wasn't the prize she had imagined. Megan Stevens sucked in a sharp breath, pacing the room, her phone gripped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I left everything for you, Ethan," she hissed, her voice shaking. "I believed in you. I trusted you." Ethan was still scrambling, still trying to salvage the situation. "Baby, listen. Don't you dare baby me," she snapped, cutting him off. "You told me we'd be living in a beautiful house. You told me we'd be set for life. And now you're telling me we have nothing?" She was unraveling quickly, but I wasn't about to stop her. I casually walked over to the counter, leaning against it as if I were watching a particularly captivating performance. Ethan's voice grew more frantic. "Megan Stevens, come on, we're in this together." Megan Stevens let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "No, Ethan, you dragged me into this mess. I didn't sign up to be broke and homeless with you." She suddenly turned to me, her eyes wild with anger. "You planned this, didn't you?" she accused. "You wanted me to find out like this." I shrugged. "I didn't force you to show up at my house uninvited, Megan Stevens. That was all you." Her lips parted, then snapped shut. She didn't have a response. The weight of the situation was finally sinking in. Ethan had used her, just like he had tried to use me. And now she was paying the price for trusting his lies. Megan Stevens turned back to the phone, her entire body trembling with rage. "I should have known," she seethed. "You didn't love me. You just needed someone stupid enough to buy into your little fantasy." Ethan's voice came through now, full of panic. "Megan Stevens, please." Click. She hung up the phone, turning to me. Her face was a mix of humiliation, rage, and something else. Something I knew all too well, regret. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, Megan Stevens did the one thing I never expected. She laughed. a short, bitter sound that barely escaped her lips. I can't believe I fell for him. I shrugged. It happens. She exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over her face. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out. I watched her go, wondering what would happen to her now. Would she go running back to Ethan, desperate to salvage what little dignity she had left? Or would she do the smart thing and walk away for good? Either way, it didn't matter to me. The one thing I knew for sure was this. Ethan had lost. And for the first time in a long time, I had won. Megan Stevens' footsteps echoed down my driveway as she stormed away, phone clutched tightly in her shaking hand. She had come here thinking she was stepping into her new life. Instead, she'd walked straight into a humiliating reality check. I didn't call after her. I didn't feel sorry for her. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. I turned back to my lawyer, who was still calmly flipping through his notes, as though we hadn't just witnessed a woman's entire world fall apart in front of us. "Well," he said, finally looking up, "that was entertaining." I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. "She thought she won," I murmured. "She really thought she had it all figured out." My lawyer smirked. "That's what happens when people believe the wrong person." With that, I closed the door, locking out the past for good. I barely had time to take a sip of my now cold coffee before my phone buzzed. Ethan. I stared at the screen, debating whether or not to answer. A part of me wanted to ignore him, let him stew in his own mess. But another part of me was curious, wanting to hear the desperation in his voice. Curiosity won. I picked up the phone, keeping my voice steady. "What do you want, Ethan?" His breathing was uneven, laced with frustration and panic. "Lila Hartman, whatever you told Megan Stevens, you need to fix it. She just called me, screaming, saying I ruined her life. You made me look like an idiot." I smirked, swirling my coffee with a spoon. "Ethan, you did that all on your own." Silence. Then his tone shifted, trying to regain control. "Listen, let's talk. We don't have to fight like this. We were married for 12 years, Lila Hartman. You can't just throw me away like I'm nothing." I almost laughed at his pure hypocrisy. "Oh, but you could throw me away?" I asked, my voice turning cold. "You could walk out, drain our accounts, move on with your younger upgrade, and expect me to just accept it?" "That's different," he snapped. "I made mistakes, okay? But I was hurt too." I let his words hang in the air for a moment before asking, "Are you happy now, Ethan?" More silence. I already knew the answer, but I wasn't done with him yet. As much as I wanted to hang up and never hear his voice again, I had one last thing to say. "By the way, Ethan," I said, keeping my tone light, "I got a call from my lawyer this morning." I could hear him swallow. "And your petition to revisit the divorce settlement?" I paused, letting it sink in. The judge dismissed it. His frustration turned to outright rage. "This isn't fair, Lila Hartman. You set me up. You planned this whole thing behind my back." I couldn't help but smile. "No, Ethan," I said calmly. "I just paid attention." And with that, I hung up. I thought that would be the last time I'd hear from Ethan. I was wrong. 2 days later, Megan Stevens was back at my doorstep. But this time, there was no smug grin, no condescending tone. She looked defeated. Her usual flawless makeup was smudged. Her once perfect blonde hair was messy, like she hadn't had the energy to fix it. I folded my arms and leaned against the doorframe. Megan Stevens. I greeted her, my voice even, emotionless. "What do you want?" She paused, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Her eyes dropped to the floor for a moment, then back up to meet mine, biting her lip nervously. And then, unexpectedly, she apologized. "I was so stupid," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I believed him. He told me you were cold, controlling, that you didn't support him. I thought—" She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I thought I was different, that he wouldn't do to me what he did to you." I let her words hang in the air, silent, giving her the space to speak. "But you were right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Everything you said, he used me. Took my money, maxed out my credit cards, and when I asked him to help with rent," she paused, tears threatening to spill over, He said I was too much to handle, that I was holding him back. In that moment, I realized Megan Stevens had become me. I exhaled slowly, studying her closely. "So, what now?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Are you going back to him?" She shook her head, laughing again, though there was no humor in it. "No," she replied firmly. "I'm done." Her voice wavered slightly, and she hesitated before continuing. I wanted to say I'm sorry." I regarded her quietly for a long moment. I wasn't sure if I had forgiven her, but I understood her now. I had been in her shoes, once full of hope and trust, only to be burned by the same person. I nodded slowly, stepping back. "Good luck, Megan Stevens." She offered a small, sad smile before turning and walking away. That night, I sat alone in my living room with a glass of wine, reflecting on everything that had happened. Revenge was supposed to feel like victory, but when Ethan finally hit rock bottom, I felt nothing. Not a rush of satisfaction, not a sense of justice. I had won, yes, but not because of his failure, because I had moved on. I had rebuilt my life. Ethan, on the other hand, was still trapped in the same cycle of self-destruction, and that wasn't my problem anymore. My lawyer had sent me the final update. Ethan had applied for a new credit card. Denied. Tried for a loan. Denied. He was sinking, and for once I wasn't going to throw him a lifeline. I lifted my glass and murmured to no one, "Good luck, Ethan." And with that, I closed the door on that chapter of my life for good. The next morning was crisp and peaceful as I walked into my boutique, the little shop Ethan had once mocked. The soft chime of the doorbell echoed, and for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. No more legal battles, no more calls from my ex, no more shadows of the past looming over me. I had won, not through anger or revenge, but by living well, by simply outgrowing him. I hadn't heard from Ethan in weeks after our last conversation, the one where he begged me to fix things. I assumed he had finally given up. But then, this morning, I saw it. A message from an unknown number. I knew exactly who it was before I even opened it. "Ethan, Lila Hartman, I messed up. I know you probably hate me, but I need help. I lost my job and I have nowhere to go. Can we just talk? Please." I stared at the screen, the message sitting there, waiting for me to react. I expected the anger to come, the resentment, the urge to hurl my phone across the room, but instead, I felt nothing. No rage, no urge to scream, just emptiness. I deleted the message without hesitation. That was it. No more Ethan, no more past, just me and my future. A week later, Megan Stevens came into my boutique. She hesitated at the door, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. I could see the nerves in her stance as she glanced around, unsure if she should even be here. I folded my arms, waiting. She took a deep breath, gathered herself, and walked toward the counter. "I got a job," she said, a quiet determination in her voice. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh," she nodded. "Marketing. It's not much, but it's mine." For the first time, Megan Stevens didn't look like the smug, self-assured woman who had stood at my door weeks ago. She looked real, humbled, changed. I gave her a slow nod. "Good for you." She let out a shaky laugh. "Honestly, I don't know how you put up with him for so long." I smirked, a hint of amusement in my voice. "I don't either." She hesitated, biting her lip. "I know I don't deserve it, but do you think we could be friends?" I thought about it, about everything that had happened, about what we both had learned and how far we'd come. I gave her a small smile. "Not friends, but maybe one day." That was enough for her. She nodded, bought a scarf, and walked out the door, starting fresh, just like I had. A year later, I ran into him again, of all places, at a gas station. I had just pulled in to fill up when I saw him standing by a rusted sedan, barely holding itself together. He looked different, thinner, worn out, a little lost. For a brief moment, our eyes locked, and in that split second, I knew exactly what was going through his mind. She got everything, and I have nothing. But what Ethan never understood was that I didn't win because I took things from him. I won because I rebuilt myself. I refused to let him steal my future the way he had tried to take my past. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, nothing more, and then I drove away. That was the last time I ever saw Ethan. Years passed, and my boutique grew, expanding into 3 more locations. I made new friends, embraced new adventures, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking back. I kept a framed quote above my desk in my office, a simple reminder of everything I had survived. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's moving on. And that's exactly what I did.